Okay, welcome to panel 2, which is entitled Democracy and the First Republic. Our first speaker is going to be Nguyen Chun, who is a professor at the University of Connecticut, an assistant professor at the University of Connecticut with a joint appointment in the Department of History and the Asian and Asian American Studies Institute. Her research is focused on the Republic of Vietnam. Today, her presentation is entitled, How Democratic Should Vietnam Be? The Debate on Democracy in Saigon, 1955. Nguyen?
This presentation is taken from a manuscript on the conflict between Ngo Dinh Diem and other anti-communists. I engaged with two major scholarly questions that have long occupied researchers. First, why was politics under the Saigon-based regime so factional? And second, why did leaders claim to be democratic but act so authoritarian? And I just also want to mention briefly, I changed these slides on the plane as I was coming here, so the first few may be slightly messed up. With that over with. So in the 1960s, most Western scholars claimed that the factionalism that they saw in Saigon reflected personality conflicts and not substantive differences between different leaders or groups. These early researchers also assumed that Ngo Dinh Diem and even other anti-communists were disingenuous when they claimed to be democratic. More recently, historians like Ed Miller and Philip Patton have demonstrated that Diem and his followers believed in their own distinct vision of democracy. Jessica Chapman has explored the factional conflicts between Diem and the sects, but I would argue that what's still missing is a study of not just the conflicts between Diem and other anti-communists, but the differences in their ideas. And so this is where my project contributes. I argue that Diem and other anti-communists both desired and feared democracy. They believed that democratic systems were more legitimate, but also more unstable. So the logical solution to their problem was to implement a partial democracy. But leaders defined democracy in different ways and debated the degree of democracy that was suitable. The factionalism between Diem and his rivals was very much a reflection of this disagreement. The presentation focuses specifically on the political debate that took place between May and December 1955, when the state of Vietnam became the Republic of Vietnam, so the SVN to the RVN. And I look at this debate in the context of the larger constitution transition that was taking place at that point. So there were three main camps in the debate. Ngo Dinh Diem's faction constituted the most illiberal camp. I call his followers Diemists. The second camp is a group I call the sect parties. These consisted of three political parties affiliated with the Cao Dai and the Hoa Hao factions that allied with Ngo Dinh Diem during the Battle of Saigon. The sect parties occupied a middling position in the debate. The most liberal camp was represented by just one individual, a northern activist named Phan Guangdang. During the first phase of this debate, both the Diemists, Ngo Dinh Diem's followers, and the sect parties presented themselves as champions of democracy. They argued that the government should become a constitutional republic and establish a representative assembly. But the allies, because the Diemists and the sect parties were in alliance at this point, the allies advocated for what political scientists call a hybrid regime. That is a regime that mixes democratic and authoritarian features. The Diemists and the sects called for representative institutions, which are democratic, but also severe limitations on civil liberties, which is authoritarian. And there were also stark disagreements between the allies. They argued over political systems and how to start the transition. However, given the similarities, these differences should be understood as one of degree rather than one of kind. The sect parties were more liberal. The main source for understanding the politics of the sects were their newspapers. The material is too thin to extract a coherent political theory, but the parties clearly equated democracy with representative institutions. The sect parties argued that the constitutional transition should start with the immediate formation of a National Assembly, Wakoi. A Guangdang newspaper insisted that an elected assembly was necessary for the people to express their will. Quote, "To speak of a National Assembly is to speak of a democratic structure that includes representatives of the people, representatives who are elected through a process that accords with the will of the people and who have the responsibility for undertaking national affairs on behalf of the entire people." Close quote. The Huahao newspaper differed slightly in proposing that the government convene an unelected provisional assembly while preparing for the elections of a more permanent assembly. So this consistent emphasis on a representative assembly suggests that the sect parties favored a parliamentary government in which the legislature enjoys supremacy over the executive. And the reason for this preference was partly because the sect parties believed that their organizational strength would ensure them a significant role in the future assembly, so it reflected their own political interests. The Yimists disagreed. Prime Minister, who was Prime Minister at that point, Prime Minister Ngo Dinh Diem defined democracy as an ethical and humanistic impulse rather than any specific institutional form. His political thought drew from the philosophy of personalism put forth by the French Catholic thinker Emmanuel Mounier. Mounier believed the basis for democracy should be the person, that is, a human being who exists in a web of social relations. He defined democracy as a potential framework that could best ensure the freedom of persons to actualize their potential and to fulfill their social obligations. Following Mounier, Diem associated democracy with social and personal morality, and he considered representative government only a means to an end. He announced in an address in early 1955 that the regime was based on the person, while democracy was only the government's guiding precept. In contrast, Ngo Dinh Diem's advisors privately argued for authoritarianism, an emphasis on privately, this was not public knowledge. That summer, Ngo Dinh Diem's office circulated a position paper arguing that Vietnam needed a strong state that could guide the country through present conditions. The paper asserted that Vietnamese people tended to rally around a leader rather than a party or a political theory. Therefore, only a strong man could simultaneously achieve popular support and create a strong government. The authors identified Diem as the man of the moment and proposed that the government rally the population by venerating him. That is, the premier's advisors believed that devotion to him could bind citizens together better than any political system. So the Yimist position reflected the fact that they already controlled the executive. So strengthening the executive meant increasing their own power. So their arguments were also in their own political interests. Ngo Dinh Diem eventually decided that the country needed a presidential system with a powerful, popularly elected president similar to the US. The decision was a compromise. He likely considered presidentialism to be more stable than a parliamentary government, but also more democratic than strongman rule. Both Vietnamese and American advisors appear to have nudged him into making this decision. The position paper quoted above warned that parliamentarism could destabilize the country. Diem's advisors likely had in mind the French Fourth Republic, with its revolving door prime ministership and contentious party politics, and feared such instability would trigger the collapse of the government. Instead, the paper favored a political system in which the executive was superior to the legislature. As the authors of the position paper explained, quote, "It is not yet possible to totally and absolutely ensure that the Prime Minister's prestige will overwhelm the legitimacy of the National Assembly. Until then, power must be divided in such a way that the essential part remains in the hands of the government so it can act with strength." Close quote. Meanwhile, the CIA operative Edward Lansdale tried to persuade Diem of the virtues of the American political system. Significantly, both the sect parties and the Diemists defined liberties, civil liberties, very narrowly. the newspaper of the main Guangdang party published a letter from a reader that likely reflected the party's own position. The letter argued that freedom of speech only included the freedom to praise anti-communist nationalism and democracy and to constructively criticize the government, but not to propagandize for colonialism and communism. The Yimists were even more illiberal. The position paper recognized only one particular liberty, the liberty of freedom, the freedom of citizens to express their loyalty to the government. Thus, neither the sect parties nor the Yimists actually favored liberal democracy, but the latter camp was distinctly more authoritarian. The Yimists championed the premier's personal leadership, called for the overconcentration of power in the executive, and equated freedom with political loyalty. The position of both camps regarding parliamentarism and presidentialism had a direct bearing on how they wanted to start the constitutional transition. The sect parties wanted a strong assembly, so they demanded that Yim publicly disavow Chief of State Bao Dai and form an assembly to draft the constitution. But the Yimists favored a strong executive, so they wanted to start the transition with an election of the head of state. Specifically, they proposed that there should be a plebiscite to simultaneously depose Bao Dai and to grant Yim the authority to draft the constitution. This Yimist vision was the origins of the plebiscite against Bao Dai on October 23rd, 1955. So I don't have time to go into the details of the plebiscite. It's also a fairly familiar story. But what's important to note is that the plebiscite was rigged, and the sect parties assisted the government in carrying out the plebiscite, albeit with some reluctance. After the plebiscite, so on October 26th, Yim issued a provisional charter establishing the Republic of Vietnam and declared himself the first president, as you can see in that picture. The plebiscite revealed an underlying similarity between the Yimists and the sect parties. Both camps willingly contributed to an unfair election in spite of their professed respect for democracy. So this is why I argue that they were more similar than different. The plebiscite inaugurated a new round of debate focused on the constitutional process. The Allies agreed on the desirability of a constitution, but clashed over who would draft it. The debate took an unexpected turn under the influence of Guangdang, a northerner allied with the sect parties. There were now three distinct positions on the desirable degree of democracy. The Yimists preferred an authoritarian regime concealed behind a facade of representative institutions. The sect parties advocated for a greater degree of liberty and pluralism, and Dang favored a robust democracy with only minor restrictions of freedom. The sect parties wanted a representative constituent assembly to draft the constitution, though they differed in the details. The Guangdang parties called for assembly elections, but the Huahao party proposed that a special committee oversee the formation of an appointed assembly. The committee would determine the proportion of seats allocated to the various parties, and every party would nominate deputies subject to the approval of the government. This plan, the Huahao plan, ensured that parties other than the Yimists would have a say in the constitution, and the Huahao newspaper argued that a multi-party constituent assembly was the only legitimate body that could draft the constitution. Meanwhile, the Yimists continued to advocate for Yim's personal leadership and the supremacy of power. The Provisional Charter of October 26 specified that a commission would draft the Constitution, and the draft would be submitted to an elected constituent assembly for approval. The plan allowed Yim to determine the composition of the commission, which meant that he could pack the body with his own supporters, and the commission could produce a draft that maximized his authority. Yimist control of the constitutional process distressed the sect parties, and they became receptive to the arguments of the recently returned Guangdang. Guangdang would later go on to become the foremost opposition leader to Yim's rule, but he was still a minor figure at the time. He appeared to advocate for what is known as a militant democracy, not a hybrid regime. A militant democracy is similar to a liberal democracy, except that it minimally restricts freedom in order to protect itself from extremist groups seeking to subvert democracy. The concept was associated with West Germany and other post-war democracies in Europe. You've probably heard that Germany has special laws outlawing Nazi parties and Holocaust denial, but German citizens still enjoy broad civil liberties. That is characteristic of militant democracy. Van Guangdang never used the term, but his vision combined expansive civil liberties and political pluralism with specific targeted restrictions. He argued that representative government would be meaningless without genuine freedom, and favored strong legal protections for civil liberties. True to the principles of militant democracy, he believed that liberty should only be restricted in the case of specific dangerous groups. He explained in an interview with the Unionist newspaper, quote, "I also agree with virtually all of my nationalist comrades that there must be measures to prevent subversion from communists, colonialists, and feudalists. But other than that, I think the time has come to promulgate democratic freedoms so that the people of the nation can positively contribute to the project of nation building in this new Vietnamese republic." Close quote. It's only going to take another 30 seconds, I promise. He did not explain the degree to which he thought freedom should be curtailed, but his minimizing of the problem suggests that his position was far more liberal than the sect parties. In particular, he championed political pluralism, the existence of a legal opposition, He argued that democracies must have a legal constructive opposition, and considered the absence of one to be tantamount to communism or fascism. So, to conclude, what put an end to this debate was Ngo Dinh Nhiem's use of brute violence. He sent the police to harass the sect parties. The police also detained Phan Guangdang. The sect parties and Dang boycotted the subsequent elections, which made it easier for Ngo Dinh Diem to create a rubber-stamped National Assembly that would approve his constitution. So what we see is this period, the victory of Ngo Dinh Diem halted this brief, more open period of debate during the RVN's history, and it foreclosed the possibility that Diem's government might develop into a more liberal regime, something less authoritarian, but still short of a full-fledged liberal democracy.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Nguyen Chen. Our next presenter is Yin Vu. She's currently an visiting assistant professor in French and Francophone studies at Hamilton College. She received her PhD from Cornell University this year, and her research focuses on 20th century Vietnamese intellectual history and youth, as well as philosophical, linguistic, and political negotiations of ideas of freedom. Her paper today is entitled Chen Văn Thung's Vision of a New Nationalism for a New Vietnam.
Hi, everyone. So Chen Văn Thung is not a figure we hear about often in the political context. He is better known for his literary works of Francophone literature, which were very widely accepted into the French editorial scene, and that was in the 1940s and 50s. And while many scholars have read him in the context of Franco-Vietnamese relations, I find that a lot of his writings divulge a concern particularly for the status of Vietnam. And it wasn't until the 1949 Élysée Accord signed by Cao Dai and Vincent Auriol that he began to write about this subject more explicitly. And it's in these writings on Vietnam, on Vietnamese nationalism, through the essays, the newspaper editorials, the letters that he wrote that ground my paper for this workshop. And so in my presentation today, I want to relate two important things from my paper to speak about Thung's new nationalism. First is the relationship between particular and universal, and what that means for a Vietnamese Francophone writer of the 1930s. And secondly, his correspondences with the Kennedy administration, which I found to be very interesting. So what I find most striking about Chen Văn Thung's ideas of nationalism can be summarized in this epigraph that begins my paper. And it starts with, what is a nationalist? It is simply a conscious and lucid man open to all new ideas who, rejecting all individualism and anarchy, advocates the nation as the first form of human society. So there are a few pregnant terms here that I wish to emphasize, and used as a point of departure. First being consciousness and lucidity, which harbor allusions to the Enlightenment. Then novelty and new, which is a key characteristic of nationalism, of his nationalism, which is to be not only distinct from communism and other struggles for independence, but also to suggest change more generally. And lastly, human society, which first strikes me as a form of civilization, but also broaches a universal quality to that civilization. And at the core of his understanding of nationalism is this expectation that a nation, whatever that was, would represent something greater than that could be experienced by all man. So such a relationship for me is quintessential to Republican ideals as they were articulated in the Enlightenment. Now, in making a direct connection to Republican ideals in Thom's understanding of Vietnamese nationalism, it's also important to address the delicate balance between particular and universal tropes of identity and freedom, where particularity ends and universalism begins. In the application of republicanism is a distinction fraught with tension and ambiguity. So, for example, in the civilizing mission that underlies French colonialism, for example, the effort to assimilate native populations into European cultures was premised upon a belief of universalizing modernity and civilization. But this, as reforms soon indicated, this violated the very liberties promised in the ideology behind republicanism. Phrased otherwise, Thom's emphasis on a Vietnamese identity in his idea of nationalism, despite being deeply influenced by values such as liberty and representation, also simultaneously thwarts this abstract universality of the Enlightenment ideology from which many of these Republican ideals derive. In fact, rather than being a mere application of Enlightenment ideology from which, rather than being a mere application of Enlightenment values, Thom's divulgence on nationalism is a direct challenge to that Republican legacy, because it ultimately reveals what one scholar, Terry Eagleton, calls the impossible irony of nationalism. And that is, the end goal of the entire process of achieving freedom is not, as the Enlightenment believed, a universal truth, right, and identity, but concrete particularity. That possibility to freely be each one of us something different, or in this case, that concrete particularity is distinct Vietnameseness. And for Thom, then, what is most important is to strike a harmony between being a Vietnamese nation and being a nation in the world. So to begin examining this interaction between nation and the world, particular and universal, it is important to consider the close connection between literature and politics for writers like Thom emerging in the 1930s. And this connection actually makes a big part of my dissertation and present research. The occupation with French writers, the preoccupation with French writers and French thought is a distinct quality of the Vietnamese writers of the French expression. Because this cohort of writers was the first to be educated in Franco-Indigenous schools and first have a choice in which language they could choose to express themselves, the faculty of liberty is especially meaningful. It was a faculty meant to be at the disposition of each individual, and it represented a larger ability to choose and construct one's own fate independent of traditional or familial expectations. For centuries, the Vietnamese individual was occluded by this collective idea, liberty compromise for the respect of traditions, order, or status. And as one of Thom's peers, Cung Dụ Nguyen, writes in a 1954 essay, Volonté d'existence, this shift to valorizing the individual was not only modern, it was necessary in order to widen Vietnamese perspectives and thresholds. And Nguyen's essay elaborates on the Vietnamese trajectory in understanding one's existence within the context of earlier institutions and limitations toward an individual, internal, and philosophical experience of freedom. And this quest for freedom begins by shifting one's priority from worshiping a fixed past to imagining a future that one can construct. And to Nguyen, this conversion was only possible through contact with another, in this case, the French or the Western beliefs, that challenged the way that beliefs shaped these emerging generations' understanding of the present. And he writes, the encounter with the West hastened the emergence of the individual, walled between these inadequate conceptions of social reality and human reality. So while this might imply that colonialism was inevitable or even justifiable, it is more insightful to me to think about this encounter with the West as a process that prompted a conscious effort toward comprehension. So language, as well as openness to difference, becomes crucial. Otherwise, the individual and his culture remains resistant to possible change. So in short, the relationship that these writers have with the French language and literary scene, therefore, is extremely delicate. Seeking to understand and to be understood is integral to one's will to exist and persist. And I really want to emphasize the term will here, or in the case of when he writes volonté. And as a vessel for communication, Thum actually also directed a journal for the Democratic Party of Vietnam that bore the same title to Nguyen's essay, La Volonté du Vietnam. The journal contained French and English language essays on the emergence of, or the importance of Vietnamese and French cooperation, as well as items of general interest on Vietnamese culture and history. So like Nguyen, the implication of Thum on this human will, or volonté, and the capacity to choose to do or not do something bears a larger political significance in determining that Vietnam has a volonté implies its sovereignty and independence, even in the context of an overarching French union. One's choice in expression seeks to fulfill a human desire for comprehension, extrapolating this seemingly minor sense of liberty to a sense of liberty that an entire country seeks. And in this way, liberty is both an individual and a human concern. Now, the cult of the individual is not independent of one's place in the world. Respect for oneself is interchangeable with respect one earns from others. And only when something as particular as Vietnamese identity and freedom to exercise what that means is abstracted to a human experience can others truly experience or understand what the Vietnamese cause was and subsequently come to their aid. So this brings me to a brief discussion of the lengths to which Thum tried to make the Vietnamese cause known and understood. And in addition to soliciting important French writers to introduce his text to the French public, so one notable individual was René Cassin, who was part of writing the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In 1948, he prefaced one of Thum's texts, and this was a way to open Thum's text to the French public. So in addition to these paratextual elements, Thum also appealed and wrote letters to the American government. So as an exile and expatriate in France, Thum was openly critical of Nguyen Diem and his administration, and was even reported in September 1963 to urge for a united anti-Diem stand among the exile community in Paris. While when Diem banned opposition parties in Vietnam in 1957, he violated for Thum what was the most important democratic quality of all, which was the freedom to express different, even revolutionary ideas, and the emphasis on difference here. Along with Nguyen Hai Binh, Thum helped to found the Democratic Party of Vietnam in 1955, which positioned itself as a viable third solution, that is, an alternative to either the Diem or the communist government. And both of these men, Binh and Thum, avidly wrote letters to the Kennedy administration, including Security Advisor George Bundy and his aide Michael Forrestal, Special Assistant Arthur Schlesinger, and Special Assistant Walt Rostow, just to name a few. And these letters may have swayed Americans to consider taking this Democratic Party seriously, because in one memorandum from Michael Forrestal to Ambassador Avril Harriman in February 1963, Forrestal suggested the possibility of expanding contacts beyond U.S. personnel in Saigon, between U.S. personnel in Saigon and non-communist elements of the Vietnamese opposition to communism as a way to increase alternatives in the event of an accident, and in the event of an accident that would result in governmental shifts. So could this lead Diem to become suspicious of U.S. intentions? Yes, but being too closely tied to Diem's government would also be very risky. So it is unclear whether from this note which non-communist elements they were talking about, and if he was referring to the Paris dissidents, which included Binh and Dong, then action was actually never taken. And by the end of the year, this idea seemed to have been scrapped completely, because in October 1963, Schlesinger forwarded 2 of Dong's letters to Forrestal, and in response, a week later, on October 24th, Forrestal curiously advised Schlesinger, even though having written something kind of advocating for this possibility, in October he wrote back and said, "At this stage, it is best to keep our traffic rather bland." So I just want to show you the 2 letters that Dong wrote to Schlesinger, and then the memorandum that Forrestal wrote first in February, and then later in October when he said that he wanted to keep traffic pretty bland. So even though for Dong and Binh, these letters were circulated within the administration with the help of Bundy and Schlesinger, these Vietnamese men only ever experienced tepid responses to acknowledge their reception. Sean Willens ventures one explanation for this, which is that President Kennedy's Cold War realism didn't make room for Vietnamese perspectives like the Democratic Party of Vietnam, who, like Schlesinger, seems to support a middle ground alternative between an anti-communist and anti-authoritarian government. And this meant that despite how unsavory a regime was deemed, U.S. foreign policy would back whatever regime it perceived to be most stable and viable to beat back communism. The fact that these Vietnamese nationalists hailed from Paris rather than from Saigon was also a major point of contention for Americans. Furthermore, it's also likely that American politicians considered these disaffected intellectuals with caution, especially in the early correspondences of 1961 and 1962, to prevent stirring any suspicion or ambiguity regarding American intentions in Vietnam. So there's still more to uncover behind these events and around why Dong and his party didn't receive enough credence. We might conclude that voices like Dong's were left unheeded in a situation of urgency, where the ambiguities of a work in progress, such as developing a nation, was not welcome. But I'm not entirely satisfied with this conclusion. So in the spirit of this ongoing dialogue about Vietnamese reflecting on different ideas of nationalism, and in offering one perspective in particular, and drawing an explicit connection of those political ideas to literary possibilities in the 20th century, I'd like to open these to discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Yen Vu. Our next speaker is Zuila Nguyen from the University of Houston, assistant professor there in the Department of Modern and Classical Languages. His research interests include critical theory and popular culture. His book, entitled The Unimagined Community, Imperialism and Culture in South Vietnam, is forthcoming in December 2019 with Manchester University Press. His presentation today is entitled The Other Vietnamese Revolution, Democracy, the State, and the Strategic Hamlet Campaign.
So the paper that I circulated presents a kind of condensed version of one of the main arguments from my forthcoming book, which is coming out at Manchester University Press in December. Makes for a very nice Christmas present. And it's entitled The Unimagined Community, Imperialism and Culture in South Vietnam. And what I want to do in my presentation today is just talk a little bit about how I developed the idea for the book, and then give you a brief summary of the main argument of the book. Of the paper. So years ago, I read through Philip Caton's very excellent study of the Strategic Hamlet Campaign, Ziem's Final Failure. And at the time, what I was struck by in particular was Caton's short but very, very illuminating description of the theory of personalism, which was the official philosophy of the First Republic. And the description by Caton seemed to me to be a pretty big departure from other characterizations or caricatures of personalism that I've read in the literature in the war in Vietnam, where personalism is dismissed variously as muddle-headed and vague, as incoherent or internally self-contradictory, or as too esoteric for the peasants to understand, or even worse, as a reactionary fascist religious ideology and an ideological cover for the personal dictatorship of the nose. In Caton's presentation, on the other hand, personalism is presented as coherent political philosophy, which really impressed me at the time because I was taking courses on political philosophy. And so that piqued my interest in personalism. And from there, I went and picked up some books by Emmanuel Mounier, and then I put them back down immediately because they were much too difficult to read. I didn't know enough about modern and ancient philosophy in order to understand some of the arguments. And so at that point, before going back to the primary text to try to understand them myself, I took a look at some of the secondary literature in Mounier and quickly discovered that Mounier and his disciples after World War II considered themselves to be Marxist. And that, in fact, personalism seemed to me not so much to be a doctrine seeking a sort of middle ground between communism and capitalism, as it's often described in the literature in the war in Vietnam, but instead it seemed more to me like something like a Marxist or a Marxian critique of both capitalism and liberal democracy, as well as the official Marxism of the Soviet Union. So against what Mounier described as the massive Soviet state with its centralized political and economic apparatus, as well as what he called the fraudulent liberalism of parliamentary democracy, capitalist parliamentary democracies. Mounier proposed a kind of decentralized communitarian communism. And so at this point, two questions occurred to me. And the first was, is this the political philosophy that the Noes are trying to put into practice? Right? Because if that is the case, then that would seem to call into question the pervasive characterization of the First Republic as being an authoritarian government dressed up as a liberal democracy. And the second question was, did the Noes understand personalism the way Mounier did, as a political doctrine that is consistent with some version of Marxism, some kind of Marxist humanism, perhaps, right? Because if that were the case, then perhaps in this early part of the war, the conflict was not simply a contest between communism and democracy, but rather something more like the way Ngo Dinh Nhu understood it, which was as a social revolution against the communist or the Stalinist revolution in the countryside. And so these are some of the questions I try to explore in the paper. And the answer I give is probably too extreme. The Ngos are Marxist humanists. It's too late to go back on that now because the book's coming out in December, so I have to stick with that. And the answer also may be kind of too straightforward. The Ngos changed their political views, they changed their policies during the course of the 9-year existence of the Republic of Vietnam. But going back to that period, I was really struck by how consistent they were in terms of their commitment to certain core political beliefs, right? And so, for example, Ngo Dinh Nhu's political rhetoric from late 1962 becomes increasingly more radical, I think more anti-capitalist too. But you can find this anti-capitalism in documents from before the founding of the Republic, though. So, for example, in the manifesto and the charter of the Gan Lao Personalist Revolutionary Party, but also in Ngo Dinh Nhu's publications in the journal Sahoy in the 1950s, right, where he lays out this kind of syndicalist position, arguing for the need to sort of transform society based upon these workers' cooperatives as anti-capitalist forms of social organization. I think that the syndicalism that influenced Nhu would also have made him skeptical of the kind of republicanism embraced by groups like the Le Fangduang, as Martina Nguyen described in her paper. And I think he would have been skeptical in particular of a French republicanism that saw itself as a complete break from the tyrannical and despotic forms of government that preceded it. So, for example, Guangdang's argument that constitutional monarchy is a contradiction because monarchy and democracy are fundamentally opposed. This republicanism seems to be based on a sort of teleological Enlightenment view of modern history as going from superstition and despotism to freedom and modern democracy. In contrast to this view, French syndicalist writers like Sorel saw a continuity between the absolute monarchy in France and the republic that emerged after the French Revolution. For the syndicalists, the shift from monarchy to parliamentary government actually concealed a kind of continuous expansion in the powers of the centralized state. And I think that it was teleological view of democracy, criticized by the syndicalists that blinded early French colonialists to the fact that even though the imperial court in Hue was not a democracy, its despotism was largely formal in character because it did not possess the sort of modern apparatus of state power that the French Republic possessed. And for the Noes, moreover, I think they opposed this type of republicanism to what they called the democracy or the autonomy of the traditional Vietnamese village, a democracy that was possible precisely because the central government during the pre-colonial period was a weak central government. Right? So, as one Republic of Vietnam government publication described, the social and political organization of Vietnam consisted of two opposing superimposed systems. At the bottom, there was popular autonomous democracy. At the top, with the absolute monarchy, which was highly centralized thanks to its Mandarin system. The text goes on and says, the Vietnamese nation, therefore, and the text here is using the concept of the nation in a sort of anachronistic way, was like a federation composed of numerous and small communal states, autonomous village communes which sprang up spontaneously and adapted themselves to the extremely centralized system of the Oriental absolute monarchies. So in terms of the relationship between the base and the superstructure, between the economic foundation and the legal and political order, this system was exactly the opposite of the one imposed by the French. So in bourgeois democracy, the formal equality guaranteed by the state conceals the existence of concrete inequality within civil society. And this is a contradiction that, according to Marx, characterized capitalism. In contrast, the absolute sovereignty accorded to the Vietnamese emperor was merely a formalized tyranny, an abstraction disguising what James Barnhart called the concrete weakness of imperial power and the democratic organization of communal production. In Mew's words, the official autocracy of the imperial state was limited in reality by the democratic nature of the autonomous organization of the village and its independence in relation to the central government. So whereas, to use Meunier's description of liberal democracy, whereas the rights of the liberal state grants to its citizens are abrogated by the facts of their economic existence, the despotic authority of the Vietnamese court was abrogated by the economic autonomy of its imperial subjects, right? So, as expressed in the famous saying, "Faites vos tours les larmes." So this was the kind of democracy, this sort of direct democracy from the base that I think the Noes were trying to recover in a modernized form through the strategic Hamlet campaigns as a program of social revolution. And the Noes view this form of democracy, this personalist democracy, as being opposed both to liberal democracy as well as to the dictatorship of the proletariat. So the personalism of the Noes was not simply a middle ground between liberal democracy and Stalinism. It was a repudiation of both those forms of government. And so one of the main arguments in my paper is that the difference between formal democracy and liberal democracy, formal or liberal democracy and this personalist democracy at the base has been ignored in a lot of the literature in the war in Vietnam. And as a result, there is this sort of pervasive characterization of the First Republic as being a authoritarian government disguised as a liberal democracy. And I think this is where my argument kind of departs from Nguyen's, because so you seem to be arguing that basically all the different political groupings in the South can be classified according to the degree of democracy that they thought was possible under the circumstances. So, given the condition of war with the North, right? But I think when you apply this classification to the Zionists, who you call the illiberal camp, right? This ambiguity sort of emerges, though, and that is that you call them this group that aimed at establishing authoritarian government dressed up as parliamentary government. But that would appear to imply that the difference between the No's and all the other political groupings is not a difference in degree, but a difference in kind. And that's my argument. I think there's a difference in kind between the No's and the rest of the political groupings, but the difference is not between authoritarianism and democracy, but rather between these two different ideals of democracy. This liberal democracy, which the No's believed was helping to perpetuate underdevelopment and also to kind of keep the state from being able to be decentralized in order to fight more effectively against the communists, and this sort of personalist democracy from the base that they were trying to implement through the Strategic Hamlet program. Thanks.
Okay, and thank you very much to the presenters for being so exacting and keeping their time, which will allow all of you to ask a robust set of questions. Please do introduce yourself, and if you have an affiliation, mention it when you give your question. Okay, I see that someone has the microphone.
Just a quick question. Nguyen, could you respond to Zui?
Sure. So I think one way of looking at it is change over time. Because the period I'm looking at, 55, 56, the rhetoric that Ngo Dinh Diem and his followers use is actually quite different from late 50s, early 60s. And the Strategic Hamlet program I believe begins in January 1961. And there's ideas about it. Ideas about it are circulating. But what I think if you follow the rhetoric of Ngo Dinh Diem, his ideas do change. And so I would say the main cleavage, initially, at least ideologically, is between the people who want hybrid regimes and people who want more democracy. This is not the subject of my own research, but my sense is that later on, the cleavage changes between Ngo Dinh Diem and everyone else, both ideologically and in other ways. Does that respond to the question?
I got the, I'm Eugene. This is a question for you. I was wondering if you've taken a look at some of the later publication of Jinsi. I think it was Jinsi, and it's supposed to be from the National Revolution movement. And it talks about particularly this issue of how personalism is to be implemented. How the strategic Hamlet is actually representation of that personalism, because it wasn't just like the strategic Hamlet. It's not just Upjinluk, it's also Kujinluk, Kongjinluk, these various organizational units that were supposed to enact this idea of communal self-sufficiency, communal self-defense, and stuff like that. So yeah.
So having seen that, though, I took a lot of the arguments about Nguyen from Jin Day Vietnam. I guess there's still some controversy about his being the author of that text. But another point about the program, the Upjinluk, that I wanted to stress, though, is that Nguyen made it clear that the program wasn't simply a sort of like emergency measure that was imposed in order to make it possible to have a future democracy, or a future liberal democracy, right? Like, he meant the program to be a social revolution that would sort of transform Hamlet such that it would be possibly to sort of weaken the power of the central state, the centralized state. And it seems from the material that I've looked at that they thought that was an important measure in terms of kind of decentralizing the war against the communists, though, and using their own tactics against them. But it wasn't simply, I think, for you, an instrument to be used by the state in order to, like, later on establish a liberal democracy.
I've got the mic. I'm Tuk Pham from Voice of America, and my question is for Professor Nguyen Tran. So in recent years, there are discussions in online forums, and people say that the idea of democracy would be doomed anyway in South Vietnam, because given the condition of the wartime, and also because Vietnamese people, they lived for hundreds, if not thousands of years under feudalism and monarchy. So what is your analysis about that? And also, we should take into context that countries like Taiwan or South Korea or Indonesia, they live under dictatorship for decades. Even they don't have any war or things like that. Thank you.
So I think there's a couple of questions contained in that question. So let me try to address each of them. So I confess that while putting in long hours to finish the manuscript, I really didn't have time to read online forums. But my answer to that, first of all, would be in 1954, 55, 56, Vietnamese politicians themselves were concerned about how much democracy they could have. So the most democratic person I could find was Guangdang, and I would say that is as democratic as any of the political elites were going to commit to, political elites that were significant, that we're going to commit to, given the difficult conditions of the country, at least in the 54 through 56 period. The second question, so I also say that argument that we lived under monarchy for so long, we can't be democratic. You find that argument in the 50s and 60s too. And I think one of the best answers to that comes from Yang Dangsheng. He said in 1962 interview, he said, look, the communists don't say, well, we can't go communist, that's just too difficult. Why is it going democratic so difficult? I would argue that if you look at places like China, North Korea, Vietnam, other places, they've all been living under monarchies for a long time. Then they go communist. Political change is possible, and political change happens. So I don't believe that there's something deterministic about belonging to a monarchy. Look at the French Revolution. So I think arguments like that really miss the idea of contingency in history. And there was a third question. Was there a third question contained in there?
No, just the context of other countries.
Oh yes, context of other countries. Thank you. That's a very good question. I'm hoping to do more on that in my own work. My sense is that what we see in Vietnam, okay, so let me back up. I believe that there's this myth, and you see this a lot in the American discourse, the Republic of Vietnam is so uniquely despotic, so uniquely authoritarian. I think if you look at the Republic of Vietnam, and then South Korea, and Taiwan, and Indonesia, and Thailand, you see a lot of similarities. And specifically within Southeast Asia, you see regimes that swing back between different degrees of authoritarianism or different degrees of democracy. We see that in Vietnam with the First and Second Republic. We see that in Thailand. We see that in Cambodia. I think there's a regional pattern that's taking place. And I think one of the problems is for so long people looked at the Republic of Vietnam from this Western model of, well, it's not democratic, it must be terrible, rather than saying there's a regional pattern of the way politics develops in these countries. And it doesn't make sense to look at this Western model. We have to develop a model based on sources from those places.
My name is Quan Phan, and my first question is for Ms. Nguyen Tran, and then tying on to Mr. Lam Nguyen. Okay, I was very interested in the group that you call the Zimist. According to popular belief, that the Zimist is no other than the President's brothers, Ngô Đình Nhu, and his theory on personalism. Okay, so do you have a certain name of the Zimist besides President Nhu, and whether they are articulated their views in any other writing than besides that of Mr. Nhu's?
So I think the question is the composition of Ngô Đình Nhiem's faction and their ideas. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. So the Ngô Đình Diem faction, I call them the Yiemists because in the period that I write about, especially 54, 55, there's actually it's fairly diverse and they're not all unified. So I call them the Yiemists in the sense that one thing that unites all of them is the support for Ngô Đình Diem as the national leader. So that's how I define them. As for the composition, this is a major difficult question I want to point out because the sources are quite thin. I would say in the period that I'm talking about in the paper, there's about 3 or 4 main wings. One of the wings is the labor wing that comes from South Vietnam's largest labor union. This another wing is the wing of what I would say these Catholic, anti-communist resistance figures from central Vietnam who clustered around Ngo Dinh Cang and Hue during the resistance against France. There's another group which is called the Spirit Group, the Nhâm Tân Thang. They put forward this journal called Spirit. They are some of the founding members of the Gang Lao Party. Most of them later on abandoned Ngo Dinh Diem. And then I would say a fourth group, and this group is much harder to talk about, is that it's this new group who joins Ngo Dinh Diem after he comes back, and this group is often depicted as opportunists. They're not people who believe in Ngo Dinh Diem in the beginning, but they see joining his faction as a way of political and social advancement. So that's about the different composition. Anyone know about the ideas?
Yeah, but the main idea of the Yimist group has been articulated mainly by his brother, is that correct?
Yes, but I think it's a little more complex than that because I don't think all the people are always working in coordination with each other. So if you look at the ideas put forward by his mass party, the Phong Trào Cách mạng Quốc gia, the National Revolutionary Movement, those ideas are actually pretty different from the Gan Lao. So the cult of personality around Ngo Dinh Diem is put forward by the Phong Trào Cách mạng Quốc gia. I don't think the Gan Lao indulges in that in the same way. The Gan Lao cadres, those are the elites, they are the ones, I think, who actually understand things like personalism and put forward that. So obviously those are the two main vehicles I see for putting forth coherent ideas about coming from the Ngo Dinh Diem faction. And the second group, I think, was more Gan Trấn Thành than Ngo Dinh Diem.
Moving on a little bit to Mr. Nguyen, you mentioned briefly again about Alain Mounier's philosophy. Of course, Mr. Nguyen mentioned about the same thing. Well, I believe that his philosophy about personalism, and when Mr. New modified it a little bit, he called it like labor, personalism, and labor. Okay, so the idea is to contradict or to oppose the idea of communist. I don't know how true is it, in view of the Alain Mounier's writing that he is not completely anti-Marxist, but he is also a critic of the capitalist movement.
So I think that Mounier is criticized the Soviet Union as a form of bureaucratic state capitalism, and I think that Mu may have adopted part of that insofar as he insists upon using the word Gan Lao instead of Lao Dao, right? And I think what he's trying to do there is argue that Lao Dao, that concept of labor, is bound up with the rise of capitalism. And in fact, he calls capitalism and communism two Western ideologies. So I think that what New is arguing then is that in BC, not seeing that Lao Dao as wage labor, as being a specifically capitalist institution, though, and what the communist state ended up doing, though, was essentially setting up a state form of capitalism.
Okay, my name is Minh in the Ho Chi Minh City University of Education, and I would like to have a question for Mr. Nguyễn Duy Lập. Yeah, in your presentation, you mentioned I think it's a very interesting argument, but I just want to ask about the data that you use in your study, because as far as I see in the paper, you just use some kind of discourse from Ngo Dinh Diem and some other one, but would you consider like using another kind of data, like for example, of the policy of the like a strategic Hamlet campaign and the implementation of that campaigns, and would it like support your argument or not? Because if you just based on something people tell, some politician told that, oh, I would like to do it. If you do the thing like this, so we can have some kind of effect. But in reality, in effect, maybe I think it's different. So what do you think about it?
So there's a little bit too much dependence in all these kind of official Republican government publications about the strategic Hamlet campaigns. But what I was surprised looking at those publications was the fact that they seem to be kind of publicly espousing some of these more radical ideas. And I was kind of surprised reading these that wasn't more well known. So Ngo Dinh Diem kept saying that in these official government publications, I Want a Social Revolution, the Americans know that this is working in the countryside, and yet somehow this is still sort of a surprising story. Yeah, so I definitely need to expand sort of the range of sources there, but it did strike me that in these sort of official documents, there was a story being told about the ideology behind the Strategic Hamlet campaign that somehow didn't make it into the sort of like the orthodox accounts of the war. But
Hey, I'm Lee Nguyễn, affiliated with the Voice America. My question is for Trần Yên Nữ regarding the President Diệm project of nation building. I'm wondering, had it been not for the sect politics like the Cao Đại and Hòa Hảo, would President Diệm have impact on like a more democratic nation building project? And after he has like established himself as the undisputed leader of the country, after he defeated the Cao Đại and Hòa Hảo, why didn't he like relax his authoritarian rule and impact on a more like democratic system for his people and allow for more civil liberties?
Well, I think both Yu's research and my own kind of address this question. So the first thing is that I don't think he would have been more democratic had it not been for the opposition. However, the opposition he faces does push him to does sort of reinforce his tendency towards authoritarianism. And I don't know that he often cites either the sects for that. It's often he complains about the rebellion, this very short-lived rebellion group led by the Dai Viet Party and the VNQDD in central Vietnam. Those are the rebellions and these rebellions take place in the winter of early winter, about February through May or February through March 1955. Those are the rebellions that Ngo Dinh Diem often points his finger to and says, this is why we cannot have multi-party politics. These opposition parties, they're not real opposition parties, they just want to overthrow the government. So the opposition did play a part in reinforcing authoritarianism. The second question is, why didn't he liberalize after he consolidated power? And so just to give some context, after he consolidates power, definitely by 1957, and there's a different group of opposition figures who push him to liberalize. And the main answer he has to them is that, and this goes into what Yui argues, Ngo Dinh Diem says, liberal democracy is not true democracy. You guys want liberal democracy, but that isn't true because people who are poor and who don't have their own land, they can't really enjoy liberal democracy. They're just too poor to think about things like voting and rights. Therefore, what we need an economic revolution. We've got to make sure we have land reform, and then we're going to implement the Strategic Hamlet program. And in order to do this and do it efficiently and make it happen quickly, we need to concentrate power so the government can act very, very efficiently without having to deal with people disagreeing. So that is Ngo Dinh Diem's argument as to why and he argues this is a greater form of democracy than liberal democracy. So that is Ngo Dinh Diem's argument for why he's not liberalizing in the political sense of the term.
Another thing that I wanted to mention about Yu's position, like he very vehemently rejected this American idea that if you simply liberalize the regime, allow oppositional parties, that somehow would kind of generate sort of support, though, and you could strengthen your nation against the communists, right? And so he pointed out that the insurgency in the South was being waged by a communist party that didn't have the benefits of that kind of liberal democracy, and it was doing pretty well. But I feel as if that's been ignored too. It's sort of like those kinds of statements by you were kind of pushed aside as examples of his authoritarianism, rather than being kind of a legitimate argument, though, against liberal democracy.
We have time for one more question. I'm sure that the presenters, however, would be more than willing to speak with you over our lunch break. So the last question.
I have the microphone. So my question is for Nguyen and for Zui. And as somebody who's also written and published about Diem, I really appreciate what you guys are doing because you're trying to unpack Diem and Yu and their ideas, and also the ideas of other important actors in South Vietnam. And I know from experience that this is really, really challenging. And I really appreciate Nguyen's point in particular about Diem changing his views and also Nhu changing their views. And these guys were constantly sort of taking in other ideas. And if you look at their policies, what they actually did in practice, it changes quite a lot over the nearly decade long period they're in power. I'm wondering if I could ask you, based on what you've... So that's a challenge for the historian, right? Figuring out what these guys were actually all about. If there is some sort of ideological core there, what actually is it? And I'm wondering if you can speak to a couple of terms that I think are very relevant to this workshop, which have come up a little bit in both your presentations, but perhaps speak a little bit more of them. The first one, of course, is republicanism. And based on what you've seen so far, how does that figure in Diem's views and in Nhu's views? Diem did found the Republic of Vietnam, right? That was in some ways his most enduring contribution to Vietnamese politics and Vietnamese culture. So that was a decision he made, and so republicanism must have meant something to him. The other one is communitarianism, because I've argued and other people have argued, and Zui, you've alluded to this, that this is really important to understanding Diem and Nhu along with other things, and that seems to be, I don't know if that's the sort of center of their thought, but it's something that they keep coming back to. And it's also a way to connect them with other people outside of Vietnam who are thinking in communitarian ways, including people like Nguyen. So I'm wondering if both of you could say something about those two terms.
Yeah, so I don't have a clear picture of how, what all the changes in policy and political views on the part of Diem and Nhu over the course of the Republic of Vietnam meant in terms of their political commitment. I don't have a clear story about that yet, in part because if you look at the publications about the Strategic Hamlet campaigns, things they said about it, they make it seem as if that was the realization of this personalism they had right from the very beginning, right? And it seems pretty compelling, but then at the same time, there's other statements where they stress sort of the kind of openness of their personalism, the fact that unlike the communists, they weren't sort of committed to one system of government. They're like whatever worked, whatever helped people would ultimately be what they wanted to put into practice. So there's that. But so at the end of my talk, I already made some statements about what I thought. But I think the communitarianism and syndicalism and Nhu's thought would have set him against the kind of republicanism as we've been defining it today, though, with the notion of popular sovereignty. And actually, maybe there's people here that could speak more knowledgeably than I can about the notion of popular sovereignty. Isn't Zangguin a new concept, like the concept of Zantap itself? It's a new concept, but it hasn't always been around. And in a sense, it kind of forecloses, I think, systems of government that may have existed before it as well. Let's see, there's the last point. So I think what I was suggesting at the end of my talk was basically that perhaps the First Republic, right, was not actually a Republican form of government, or at least sort of the ideal they had in mind was not that of a Republican form of government. If indeed there was this other concept of democracy, this communitarian democracy that Diem was attached to.
So that's a pretty tough question, but I'm going to give it a shot. I think for Ngo Dinh Diem, the word republic, he uses it a lot, but he never really defines it, and I actually can't find definitions of it by people in his faction. So they often talk about the Republican regime and the importance of defending the Republican regime. And as far as I can tell, that seems to be the defense of his government. However, I do think there is one place in which it really is important, and that's in the plebiscite against Bao Dai and the anti-Bao Dai movement. So that it's supposed to be this anti-monarchical thrust. But that I think his discussion of republicanism is pretty thin. Where I do think that term is, for another person who I do think that term is actually important, is Phan Guangdang. So Phan Guangdang, he is a minor figure during the resistance against France. He was a member of the VNQDD. He broke with it to support Bao Dai. after the Élysée Accords in 1949, he gets disappointed with Bao Dai. He breaks with Bao Dai, and at that point he establishes the Republican Party. And what he means by that is a party that's not monarchical. And for him, I think it is really important to understand this idea of a party that's not monarchical, that is, I think, influenced by French republicanism and possibly later his time in the United States. So he has this long treatise in French, so it's slightly painful to read if your French is not good like mine. I'm sorry, if your French is as bad as mine. But that he argues that everything is based on freedom, and specifically freedom of thought. And I think that comes out of the French Republican tradition. For communitarianism, it's not a term that's important for the opposition as far as I can tell.
Thank you very much.
May I ask the last question for Ian? A great paper, and really enjoyed reading it. But I was wondering if you could take a few last minutes to talk about how it plays within your academic research agenda. Is it connected to your dissertation, or you're gonna develop it further into something else? Could you?
Can I add something to it? Because I meant to add
Sure.
something. Just when you say maybe a few words about Ian, but the novel that he's better known for,
Thank you for your questions. So Trần Văn Tùng, he's better known for this novel called Bạch Yên, and what's really interesting about this novel, so it's called Bạch Yên, or Girl with a Loyal Heart, and so it's about a young scholar in Hanoi who his family lives in the countryside, and then he goes to Hanoi, he meets this woman, falls in love with her, and there's a lot of spatial differences between the countryside and Hanoi as this intellectual place, and the whole entire novel is about this love story, so it seems. At the very center of the novel is this speech that he makes to Bạch Yên, who as a female character in this novel, and it's about, the whole novel seems to be about her and his love for her, but she's actually just the confidant, and this moment in the novel where he makes this declaration is about Vietnam and how young the youth should have their freedom to be able to express and learn what they want to learn. So from my readings of Bạch Yên, it seems to be a very political novel rather than just the kind of romantic francophone text that it seems to be. And in terms of Trần Văn Tùng and the rest of my research, he is one of 5 intellectuals that I look at, in addition to Cung Dụ Nguyen, who I mentioned, Phạm Văn Ký, who was a very famous francophone novelist, and a few other kind of people you don't really hear about. So Đào Đăng Vĩ is another one, and so he makes up this cohort, I say, that really kind of changes the way that the architecture of what it means to reflect on oneself through another language. And so this is kind of what Trần Văn Tùng as a writer and then future diplomat kind of represents in my research. And so the riff of the Kennedy letters, or the letters to the Kennedy administration, is something new that I haven't incorporated in my dissertation or potential manuscript, but it's an interesting direction.
Okay, thank you everybody for attending panel 2.